Good afternoon, everyone. Hi, it's John Snyder, another edition of Newton-Wellesley Medical Group Lunch and Learn. We are happy to invite back to the hot seat Dr. Michael Crathen, one of our dermatologists on staff practicing over in Natick. I'm sure he'll tell us all about our practice, and actually with a large Instagram following, which I just learned on social media. So thanks, Michael. Can you go ahead and advance to the next stage? We'll tease up upcoming Lunch and Learns. So next week, we have a great talk by Lois Levine talking about taking care of yourself, tools for healthcare professionals. And then the following week, we have one of our new gastroenterologists on staff, Dr. Daria Homenko, talking to us about the general approach to diarrhea. Moving into the summer months, that is becoming more and more evident. Before we leave this slide, just a couple of other learning opportunities we want to make sure you guys are aware of. First of all, these talks are all archived up on the intranet on Newton, as well as up on YouTube by simply searching for Newton-Wellesley Medical Group Lunch and Learn. Further, we have our APP Grand Rounds. We heard a great Grand Rounds two days ago. It's the second Tuesday of each month. That is hosted by Amy Israelian, and it was on pulmonary nodules in the Pulmonary Nodule Clinic, and Sean Lear gave a great talk. And we want to invite you guys to make sure you're taking advantage of that. That's at lunchtime as well on Tuesday, second Tuesday of each month. And then we also, of course, have our weekly series Wednesday morning. Dr. Larry Friedman, Department Chair of Medicine, gives an amazing series from the Department of Medicine in Grand Rounds. And we look forward to those talks on a weekly basis. Next slide, please, Michael. So we have our upcoming last version of our Taking Charge of Financial Wellness. This is the fourth session. I chose this session as an estate planning session. I think it will be a great talk to hear. We did place them in the evening, and hopefully you'll have time to put down Epic and come home and sit and watch this at your convenience. From 6:30 to 7:30. We do realize that that is not a great time for a lot of people. So if that time doesn't work for you, we do record all these sessions, and they are available on our intranet by searching Financial Wellness. The host series is available. I've been hosting them. They have been great. They are hosted and put off by New York Life Financial. And you will see if you take the time to listen to them, there's no hard sell there, just informational for your purposes. So please take advantage of this series. Next slide. And then we also wanted to make sure people get a chance to try the Shipley Fitness Center for free before this offer ends, Wednesday, June 1st. It is open 4:30 a.m. to 10 p.m. on weekdays, and also on the weekends, very long hours, 5 a.m. to 6 p.m. Please, if you're having trouble accessing this or have any questions about our health center, Daniel Destin would be happy to give you any answers. His email is posted here. Next slide. And then we have our physician care concierge service. This benefit, it goes through November of 2022. If you have not used this, you're missing out. This is a great valet service for things that you might need to do research but have no time to do, such as who's going to fix my car, who's going to mow my lawn, you know, who's going to fix my roof, or get me figure out what the best Father's Day gift is to get. They will do all this work for you, very non-invasive. They do reviews. They'll even make appointments for you, and you just send them an email with your request, and it comes back very quickly. So please take advantage of it. Go to communities.circles.com and enroll with the welcome code NWH, and it's yours with +1 access through November 2022. Thanks. Next slide. And I think that's it. Thanks, Michael, for being here. Appreciate it.
Okay, thanks, John, and for the invitation, and everybody for joining in. Just thought I'd give a brief overview of some of the new drugs and therapies and things that are hitting the market for atopic dermatitis. 2022 so far has been a big year in atopic dermatitis. Just to summarize, you may remember years ago for psoriasis, we didn't have too much besides topicals and phototherapy, and then the biologics hit the scene. This is probably 15, 20 years ago now, and now there's an explosion continuing in psoriasis, and now we're going to see something similar with atopic dermatitis as well. The reason it's, I think, quite important is because, as you'll see, a lot of these newer drugs are really quite potent, and so we may see, you know, not just the targeted therapies that we're seeing with psoriasis, but you know, we may see a lot of side effects, and we'll have to enhance kind of the communication between dermatology and primary care, maybe infectious disease potentially as a result of some of these medications. I have no disclosures to report, and off-label therapy will likely be discussed as well. Just to summarize, and I'm going to go rather quickly, but I'll try to leave some time at the end for questions as well. These are just some representative photos from DermNet, which is my favorite website to show pictures. By the way, if you're not familiar with it, you can sort of see the mark down here, DermNet NZ. It's a New Zealand-based dermatology website you're probably familiar with, but if not, it's great to look through some images. So eczema is really the itch that scratches, and these kind of weeping, eczematous, bright pink, sometimes lichenified plaques really are typical. And the eczema presents differently depending on the age. You know, infants tend to have more extensive surfaces versus toddler, and then as you get into middle-aged. I think one of the things that's come out of the woodwork a little bit is that eczema is typically thought of as a pediatric disease, which, you know, generally the onset is pediatric. But over the past 5 to 10 years, more of like an adult eczema onset has been described. So patients really didn't have much of an eczema history in adulthood with onset of pretty classic eczema. And so that's something to keep in mind when you have an adult. Obviously, you want to keep in mind the differential of something like an allergic contact dermatitis or an irritant contact dermatitis. Those are things to keep in mind too. But we're definitely seeing adults and even elderly, you know, kind of in patients in their 70s, 80s plus with pretty bad eczema that was really new onset for them. Some keys to that, you might want to think about somebody who has a history of asthma or seasonal allergy, so that atopic kind of diathesis, that would make sense for that later onset. I'm not going to really go a lot into this, but this does play a role in kind of how the different drugs are coming out. So in terms of pathogenesis, we really think of eczema still as in this atopic background with having barrier dysfunction. So the skin barrier itself just isn't doing a good job in terms of keeping the outside world out and the inside world in. And then along with barrier dysfunction, there's a lot of upregulation of inflammatory pathways, including the Th2 cytokines like IL-4, 13, 31, amongst others as well. And then the microbiome, you know, which we've all heard a lot about, is on the skin as well. And there's also, so it's altered. There tends to be increased infections with staph. There's the amount of like staph bacteria, especially pathogenic staph, tends to be enhanced in patients in the skin, as opposed to having kind of a broader, more natural range of colonizing bacteria on the skin. And then, you know, things that normally the body uses to fight off infections like cathelicidins are also kind of like downregulated. So we think of barrier dysfunction, upregulation of inflammation, and then also changes in the microbiome. And typically the management's been based on those three, you know, so we want to support the barrier, avoid irritants, moisturize. We want to reduce inflammation, and that's when steroids and calcineurin inhibitors have been helpful. Sometimes a pulse of steroid, which try not to do. And then historically, when patients were really bad, we did things like phototherapy, and we just suppressed the immune system. We give them methotrexate and sometimes Cellcept and things like that. And then for this microbiome, bleach baths we think of, and then you know, when there's an infection, oral antibiotics. So kind of what's out there that's coming out soon. I mean, this is actually a little bit older now, but crisaborole is on the market now, and that's a prostaglandin DE inhibitor. But the new stuff coming out is the JAK inhibitors, both topical, which is actually FDA approved this year, and then there are 2 oral JAK inhibitors that are on the list here as well. Dupilumab has been out since a few years, several years now, and that's been great. And then there are increasingly indications for younger and younger age based on newer studies. I'll talk about Trelokinimab, which is hit the market as well, and this is a drug that I won't mention too much, but it's on the way, an anti-IL-31 inhibitor, and you know, phase 3 clinical trials are underway right now. So dupilumab is the first biologic that hit the market for atopic dermatitis, and it's a humanized or a human monoclonal antibody that blocks IL-4 and 13. So it blocks both of those cytokine pathways, first approved in 2017. And the reason I put a question mark, it's now approved to 6 years, and it seems like probably this summer or soon we may get indication down to 6 months, which I really think speaks to the safety of the drug and the efficacy. Right now, it's indicated for moderate to severe atopic derm, asthma, and chronic rhinosinusitis. Side effects are possible, but we see things like keratitis, conjunctivitis that can be quite problematic, which can warrant a referral, for example, to ophthalmology. Injection site reactions, sometimes you can see herpes reactivation as well in the skin. There are case reports of things like alopecia areata onset after starting dupilumab and maybe a rare serum sickness, but overall the drug is quite well tolerated. Just wanted to review the initial phase 3 data that Eric Simpson and others published in the New England Journal in 2016. And here you can just see this is IGA is kind of the physician's just kind of global score. And this is, they had to be either clear or almost clear to qualify. And SOLO 1 and 2 are the two parallel studies that were done, the phase 3 randomized controlled trials that were placebo controlled. And you could see that dupilumab, whether it was given every other week or weekly, hit about 40% there. And you can see here in the curves hitting, this is the change in EASI. EASI is, and you'll see this in multiple other tables and slides, that it's the Eczema Severity Index. And that's just an objective way that trials are performed to follow skin activity. And you can see placebo has their own curve, but you can see clearly dupilumab beats that. And this is, both of the trials, again, SOLO 1 and SOLO 2. And then itch, pruritus is really a key part of what makes eczema so bothersome to our patients. And you can see itch scores are followed, and they improve as well. So new on the market for 2022 is an IL-13 inhibitor. As you may remember, dupilumab is a IL-4 and 13. So this is slightly more targeted. It's just hitting the IL-13 pathway. Also approved for moderate to severe atopic dermatitis, but only in ages 18 and older right now. It's only in the adult population. Side effect profile, not surprising because the mechanism is similar. Conjunctivitis was also seen in a small number of, viral URIs and skin infection were noted. And it turns out actually a lot of these studies, both the Trelokinimab and dupilumab, the skin infections were actually lower in the treated group versus the placebo, because actually the drug's effective at restoring the skin barrier. And as you may remember, once we improve that, we're going to improve the microbiome, and then we're going to have fewer infections. And so actually the safety looks better in some ways on these therapies. This just goes over, again, the trial data for Trelokinimab, and they had the extra 1 and 2 trials. And you can see it's placebo-controlled, Trelokinimab in the blue, and that's hitting about the IGA of clear, almost clear at 4 months of 16%. You may go back and say, hey, wait a second, dupilumab was 40%. But again, this is why you can't really compare numbers in clinical trials, is because in the dupilumab study, if somebody used topical steroids, they were considered a non-responder. But in, they were allowed to use it in the dupilumab study, but in the Trelokinimab extra 1 and 2, you couldn't use topical steroids or you were considered a non-responder. But then they did a third study, which is extra 3, and actually, when they look at that data, then it was pretty similar in terms of the prior reported data for dupilumab. Again, it wasn't a direct comparison, but at least when they were allowed to use topical steroids, the numbers were looking pretty similar. Again, in terms of that week 16, having an IGA score of clear, almost clear at about 40%. Now, I want to spend some time on JAK inhibitors, and these are approved for other indications of note. We're seeing JAK inhibitors in rheumatoid arthritis, but they're now hitting the market in dermatology. And so, this is brand new for us in dermatology, and some of you may be familiar as well, but if not, just going to give you a brief kind of update on that. So Abrocitinib is now FDA approved this year, 18 and older for moderate to severe, and then Patacitanib also approved this year, younger indication, 12 and older. The Abrocitinib folks say that they're working on getting their juvenile data reviewed by the FDA to get a younger indication, but hasn't happened so far. Imagine, so this is just the JAK-STAT pathway that if you're not familiar with, it's good to know about. JAK-STAT pathway is involved in lots of different cytokine signaling pathways for various things throughout the body. So it actually inhibitors of the pathway can very broadly affect the body. So this is kind of very different than the targeted therapies that we've been accustomed to in psoriasis, for example, or even with Dupilumab or Trelokinimab. The JAK inhibitors basically will block one of the JAK-associated kinases. And so, typically you have a cytokine that, connects with the receptor, and then that leads to phosphorylation. And then these STATs will then bind and then, alter transcription. So it's a very potent pathway, but it's also canonized and it's seen throughout much of the body. You can block that with antibodies or also these JAK inhibitors as well. These are small molecule inhibitors, and the JAK inhibitors are oral as opposed to biologics, which tend to be injected. And so some patients who have been historically fearful of injections and they prefer an oral therapy, this is exciting news. Now, again, just to show you how broad this is, the JAK-STAT pathway is involved in T cell proliferation, myeloid differentiation, airway reactivity, responding to worm infections, so it's lipid metabolism. And so it really could be quite broad, the effects. Some of the JAK inhibitors are non-selective. So things like Tofacitinib, Baricitinib, Ruxolitinib, Tofacitinib, actually Baricitinib, I don't think I have it. Oh yeah. So non-selective, or you can have more selective, therapies like JAK1, JAK3 inhibitors. There's also this TYK2 pathway that's coming down the road for psoriasis. And then, so up here you can see, here's IL-4 and here's IL-13. So these were the antibodies for, let's say, biologics would be targeted upstream, but then downstream you have this whole kind of pathway downline. Just to know, so we're going to talk about Patacitanib and then Abrocitinib, which are JAK1 preferentially selective, but then also non-selective. The topical, we've got Ruxolitinib that we'll talk about as well, which is approved orally actually for myelofibrosis, GVHD, and polycythemia vera. But now it's Ruxolitinib is a topical with FDA approval for ages 12 and older, atopic derm. Just to know also, Baricitinib is coming down the line. Looks like probably this summer we may get approval for alopecia areata. There's a phase 3 that was published. It's already FDA approved for RA, so we may see an expansion of the indication. Tofacitinib has been used off-label for several years now, and that's on label for psoriatic arthritis, RA, and ulcerative colitis. And then I'll just mention too, the TYK2 inhibitors are coming out probably down the line as well in the next 6 to 12 months. Phase 3 studies really look clean for psoriasis. TYK2 seems to be a little bit more specific, and the safety has been looking quite good on that too. So something that's worth knowing about coming down the line. So alopecia areata, psoriasis. So a lot of exciting things coming down the line for this JAK-STAT pathway. Patacitanib is again oral JAK1 selective inhibitor, approved this year, ages 12 and up. Now, if you look at the indication, this is like, whoa, quite a mouthful, right? This is a treatment of adults, pediatric patients, refractory, moderate to severe, not adequately controlled, including biologics or when they're inadvisable. Can you go to somebody who's got moderate to severe atopic dermatitis directly to Patacitanib? I think you can, but it's on label. There is this intimation that maybe you should be trying something else, like perhaps a biologic. And this will go into this is likely because of the safety profile, which I'll go into as well. I'll just summarize here just show you some photos. This is actually from the company's website showing before and after baseline on the left, and then at week 16, the photo on the right. So clearly somebody who has a lot of excoriations and activity, and then clearing quite nicely. And same thing on the arm. The clinical trial was actually randomized with dupilumab as the comparator. So instead of placebo, they went against the standard of care drug dupilumab. You can see very early, and this is one of the things that the companies like to promote, is that the response, especially at week 2, is a very quick onset of both itch relief and starting to get control of EASI-75 scores. And this is one of the first times we've actually started to look at EASI-90. So EASI-90 is basically a 90% improvement of that baseline EASI score. So they're just, when you go from EASI-75 to 90, it's like a positive 75 to 90. You're basically increasing the threshold to get, making it a little bit harder to hit the benchmark. And you can see at the 4-month basically time point that Patacitanib beat dupilumab. Now, it's interesting, this is at the 30 milligram a day dose, which is the higher dose. The drug is meant to be started at 15 milligrams a day, and then if there's not enough response, then you can bump it up. But interestingly, this is really the data for the higher dose. And you can see here, dupilumab showing improvement in itch, but also a more dramatic, more rapid improvement in itch with Patacitanib. But let's talk about safety. Because these drugs are not selective, the safety profile is different, and I think that there's a black box warnings which we'll go through. But you can see here there were some transaminitis increases, anemia, neutropenia, CPK elevation was noted, and these were kind of predicted effects based off of the JAK-STAT pathway diagram that I showed you before, knowing our knowledge of what other pathways in the body are affected through the JAK-STAT pathway. Acne was a bit of a surprise, though, I think, to the investigators that that much was noted in the drug. And then again, consistent with the known side effects, the dupilumab side effects were higher in terms of conjunctivitis. That was notable. Abrocitinib, similar drug, oral JAK inhibitor, also approved this year. For adults, that's the main difference in terms of the indication. And again, they're trying to look into their data to get the pediatric indication, but right now it's limited. This is also meant to start at 100 milligrams a day, and then you can double the dose as well. Again, this is from the company's website showing baseline and then week 12. The abrocitinib was published in the New England Journal last year, and it was abrocitinib again against dupilumab being the standard of care drug, showing that the abrocitinib dose either at 100 or 200 that was actually about the same as dupilumab, so it's not inferior, but that the 200 milligram dose actually was the only dose that actually beat dupilumab in terms of the itch at 2 weeks. It's important to know. But otherwise, it looked at least as good as dupilumab, if not better, especially at that higher dose. In terms of going into the SAEs, though, or the adverse events, similar to what I just showed you with Patacitanib, with acne being reported higher, and same things like infectious complications like zoster, but conjunctivitis again being higher in dupilumab. So the black box warnings for JAK inhibitors, are really present no matter what the disease indication is. And so that's important. So even for these eczema drugs, we have to tell our patients that there's a black box warning out, and that's for no matter what the indication is. And that includes major adverse cardiac events, thrombosis, including pulmonary embolism, malignancy, viral reactivation, serious infections. And, how do we square this with giving these heavy hitting drugs to patients with eczema? And I think that's a little bit to be seen so far. You have these targeted biologics like dupilumab and trelokinimab, where the side effect profile seems to be much cleaner and much more narrow. And then you've got these broad-acting JAK inhibitors. Notably, these black box warnings originate through rheumatoid arthritis population data. And really, a lot of these weren't noted in any of the clinical trials for atopic dermatitis. And so what we have to ask ourselves is, have we not seen these side effects because it's a different patient population and we're not going to see these adverse events? Or do we just not have enough patients that have run through the drug yet to actually see some of these adverse effects? A lot of these patients, besides having the RA population, they were treated with a different drug like tofacitinib, and then they also were potentially on even methotrexate, and so they were on multiple drug therapy. And so there's some truth to that, so based off of the data so far, at least the oral JAK inhibitors, abrocitinib and upadacitinib, look like they're safe in eczema, but this black box, all of these black box warnings do apply and should be reviewed with the patient beforehand. Because of the potential downstream effects of the JAK inhibitors in the JAK-STAT pathway, baseline labs are required, including CBC and lipids, CMP, looking at infectious serologies and screening for tuberculosis. And then on label, it says basically you have to follow lipids, and then every 12 weeks, and then what they call thereafter. So there really isn't any very clear way to monitor after, but intermittently checking the labs is going to be sensible. So what comes down the line? We've got these IL-4, 13, 31 pathways, just this kind of cool stuff coming up. Bullous pemphigoid prurigo nodularis, maybe pruritus of unknown origin. And then in terms of the JAK inhibitors, again, with maybe alopecia areata, vitiligo, lupus, dermato, so it's pretty interesting. Very quickly, I know we're almost out of time. This JAK inhibitor is topical. Ruxolitinib is more broad, but the data look quite good. I'm just going to skip ahead here. Side effects really are the same for the ruxolitinib or the placebo. And then just showing here in terms of the itch scores and showing that ruxolitinib was approved at 1.5%, had certainly beat placebo here. Future therapies coming out, IL-31 potentially for, again, itch, maybe, and again, dupilumab, maybe prurigo nodularis, bullous pemphigoid in as young as age 6 months. Sorry that was so quick at the end, but I just want to make sure we're staying on time. Just wanted to say a brief word. We had invited, Brooke Simus has now been in our practice about 8 months, and she's doing a great job in our physician assistant. And then this summer, we're having Samira Gupta join to help with Mohs surgery for skin cancers. We also are starting some clinical trials in the office, including these 2 agents for psoriasis. One's randomized placebo-controlled for patients with skin of color, and the other is for nail, genital, and scalp. So if you know anybody who has had a hard time getting on a biologic, these are potentially good avenues for them for psoriasis. I thank you for your time. Happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Michael, for that the overview of these newer agents. It's really helpful. Do you foresee a time when we are not going to be treating atopic dermatitis with topical steroids, or as these medicines really start to proliferate, or you feel like these are really for refractory cases?
It's interesting. Psoriasis started with the biologics for moderate to severe psoriasis, and still I think that now like the mild psoriasis patients who are still treated with topicals are kind of like feeling like a little neglected. However, Premolast is now, which had a moderate to severe indication before, now has been widened to mild, and so I think that there's a potential role for some of these systemics to affect more mild cases, but I think in general, with cost containment and just safety profile, I think especially for mild eczema, we're going to be using topical steroids, topical calcineurin inhibitors, and even topical JAK inhibitors like ruxolitinib for sure. And I think that's going to be the preference before extending it to some sort of systemic therapy. So I think there's always going to be barrier function, moisturizing, all of those kind of basics is going to continue to be a part of it, except for the patients with moderate to severe, and then they kind of go on a systemic agent, and often they clear. You know, my patients on dupilumab, and it's hard to get them to come back into the office because they're doing so well. They do no topical skincare, and they're really happy, and they're like, why do I even need to see you? Things are going great.
How long does that affect? Is the effect, I'm assuming, is once you stop taking the medicine, is it gone, or how does that work usually with the dupilumab at least?
Yeah, I have to look. I think there are some data showing that patients who can be on dupilumab for a period of time stop, and then they can have quite a long period, maybe up to a year or so, where they really don't go back to moderate to severe disease activity. But in general, I think there are some studies that look at patients who go on episodic use of dupilumab versus staying on drug, and they certainly have more flaring when they're in the episodic group.
Excellent. Thanks again, Michael. And here's his contact information and his website as well. And we'll see you all next week for some self-care stuff for us and as being providers. And I hope everyone has a really nice weekend. It's supposed to be a beautiful weekend, hopefully one of the first big spring, summer weekends. And we'll see you all next week. Thanks. Thanks again, Michael, for being here.
Thank you.